defines a generation. Music is the soundtrack of revolution. Music is the soundtrack of movement. Music is the soundtrack of cause. There is an intersection of politics and pop culture that you didn't even know existed. There's some boy, some girl sitting in a cubicle along K Street, somewhere in DC. A boy, a girl sitting in a cubicle along a hill with a Capitol with a dome who has single-handedly decided what you wore today. Whoa.
Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
Gotta be real with it. Yeah. Kiki, do you love me? Are you riding? Say you never ever leave from beside me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mike Muse Show. I am so glad that you guys have joined us again for another episode on this show. And from what I've been gathering over social media, you guys are really getting into the conversations that we're curating here. We are having a ball on the Mike Muse Show, curating really dope conversations to really be informative and to really approach all these issues just from a unique angle and perspective. And I think the best thing that I got a chance to see on my DM and my Instagram was a listener of the show, Shannon. She showed on her Instagram stories 3 pages of notes that she took on the cryptocurrency conversation that we had, and that just made my day and just made me smile, guys, to know that you guys are really into it the way that you are, man. And so the more into it that you are, the more into it I am, man. This must force me to do something bigger and better each and every time to knock it completely out of the park. And I think I've done that actually with this current episode that we have coming up right now on global diplomacy through food. I have been really talking about lately this global diplomacy as we begin to look at the global economics and our shared economy and how our worlds are really connecting and our countries are really coming together really from this global international diplomacy perspective. And if you guys are a fan of chess and not checkers, I suggest you tune in what's happening on the news right now, because it's all a game of chess. It's all a game of strategy. And what's really missing from the larger conversation and narrative is this term soft diplomacy. Soft diplomacy is just the development needs of a country, the economic needs of a country, the resources that countries need for stabilization and for security. And I think that's such an important piece of it. And there is nothing better than that soft diplomacy than food. I know, right? Food. Who thinks of food as soft diplomacy? But let me tell you, food is the heartbeat, I think, of any diplomacy. I think when I'm upset, it's normally because I'm hungry. And when I'm happy, it's usually because I have a good meal in my belly. And so that's always a cool thing. But I was watching recently on 60 Minutes, and if you guys remember the young Saudi prince, Mohammed bin Salman, when he came over here, he sat down with Nora Roberts on 60 Minutes, and they were just talking about the young prince's, his mission and his vision that he has for Saudi Arabia. And no lie, in the backdrop was a Shake Shack. I literally sat up on the couch and I was like, yo, wait a minute. There's a Shake Shack in Saudi Arabia? No way. And it made me just think about like, wow, what is happening with American franchises? What is happening with American culture as we begin to enter into different places around the world and around the globe? And what does that say about how countries are adapting to our ways and our way of life? And so this episode really will examine America's impact on the global diplomacy through the business of food and franchises. And I'm talking about American fast food, fast casual, think like Shake Shack. And with the increase of American food franchises in the Middle East, UAE, how is American culture shaping local communities here and throughout the world? How are the local customs impacting the American way? What bridges, if any, are being built culturally through food? And of course, what policies are needed for franchises to enter foreign countries? How do American companies politically engage with local governments in the role of entrepreneurship? These are all questions that just came rushing through my mind as I was beginning to watching this. And I was like, this is a conversation that I have got to curate. And boy, did I curate something special for you guys. I have 3 fantastic guests coming onto the show today who are extremely brilliant, extremely smart, extremely creative, and have a really great pulse on world food and global business and global entrepreneurship and policies that really dictate how individuals can eat a cheeseburger over in the UAE. And so without further ado, let's just get into it, folks. Let's just get into the food. And so my first guest that I have with me, man, she is something absolutely fantastic, something special. When I got a chance to read about her background and really hear her story, I was like, I've got to have her. She is a world-renowned chef, and she's based here in New York City. She goes by the name of Chef Alia Lee Kong. She's a first-generation American whose parents are, get into this, people, Tanzanian and Indo-Pakistani immigrants. I know, that's like almost like a tongue twister, so I'm going to ask her how did she say that so fast. Alia's insight into cooking was always through a lens of layered culture upon culture, if you think about it. The idea of cultures are blended with one another to create amazing foods is one that is instinctive to Alia. Alia can be seen in kitchens from John George's Devi to Per Se, as well as she was the chef and culinary creative director of the renowned Indian restaurant here in New York City called Janoon. But what's interesting, though, because she has that backdrop, her multicultural upbringing and her world travels have inspired her, not only just her cooking, but her awareness on global issues related to food and food securities and women's rights and roles and children's education. And folks, I saw her on Instagram, and she has this really cool hashtag called Banned Foods. And she will always show like these cookings, these recipes, and they look so delicious. I'm like, wait, what is this Banned Foods thing? I said, you know what? I have to have her on the show, so I'm going to ask her more about it. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the incredible, the talented Chef Alia Lee Kong. What's happening, Chef?
What's up, Mike? How are you?
How you doing today?
Good.
Did I get everything right? I mean, you have an incredible background in bio and history of food, so I hope I nailed it.
No, you did. You did.
You trying to leave anything out? Okay, perfect. All right, let's just get to it. Banned foods. Tell me, like, what is that?
I think, so you pointed out my background. It's Pakistani and Tanzanian. And, I grew up in a Muslim household. And, when the ban came, and it was really a Muslim ban through President Trump, I just felt like, how can I protest? What's a way that I can protest? And not really protest. It's really about my thesis on food and global food, which is that food creates empathy, like you're talking about, the soft diplomacy. This idea of cultural empathy, how can I do that? And so I started cooking these dishes and showcasing them and taking these photos to see if I can get people to kind of relate to that food, if they can't quite relate to the people yet. And so that was sort of the inspiration for it.
Tell me some of the dishes from some of the banned countries.
For
anyone, people would not be familiar with all the banned countries. Tell us some of the countries that really come to your mind and some of the cuisines of those countries.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I really love Irani food. It's really beautiful. It's what you think of when you think of kind of like Middle Eastern cuisine is so broad. There's so many different influences, but this is the one that has like the pistachios and the raisins, the apricots, has that like sweet, salty crunch. It has like a lot of different flavors in it. It's a beautiful cuisine. So I did a really great jeweled rice. They have a beautiful rice dish called jeweled rice that's sort of flecked with all of these different colors and nuts and seeds and dried fruit. I also did a pomegranate and walnut stew from Iran called fesenjan, and it's a chicken pomegranate stew that's delicious. And then a country like Yemen, which you don't think about, they have this honeycomb bread that's just ridiculous. It's like a doughy bread that's filled with like a cream cheese, and then it's sort of glazed in this like orange blossom honey syrup. It's to die for.
I'm really mad that you didn't bring any for Christine and I right now. I'm kind of upset about that.
I know. I should have brought real, IRL.
But I really think about that, and just in terms of how you're describing it, and you're really painting this incredible picture of just the food, right? I can actually see it and somewhat kind of taste it, especially when you said the honeycomb, right?
Oh, yeah. And
these are, as you mentioned, you don't really get a chance to learn a lot about these countries, right? We hear all these countries from this negative context and like this negative connotation, and so we really have this biased viewpoint of these countries because a lot of us can't travel over there, even before the travel ban occurred. Like, how do you do it? And so for you, do you think food is a cultural exchange, right? That allows us to travel when we're unable to? Oh,
for sure. I think that's a way in. That's a way to see through people's eyes. When you're making something that someone is making in their home country, you're sort of sharing that experience with them. And I think it's just a beautiful way to connect with people.
to give some even more context to it, just to kind of show how diplomacy and food has always come together. I mean, just think state dinners. When we talk about the White House having these state dinners, they usually are centered around food, right?
For sure.
And it's a big pageantry in the White House in partnership with the Secretary of State, Department of State, I should say. They go through this incredible cadence and this incredible pageantry and months of preparation in terms of what food's going to be served and how it's going to be served, because it really breaks the ice, right?
I think it
really breaks the ice of it all.
It absolutely breaks the ice, and it also creates a level of personal intimacy immediately, right? When you're eating what someone else eats. It's just, I think it takes everything to the next level.
And even what's interesting about that was that recently, North Korea has been in the news a lot lately. We just come across our North Korean summit was in Singapore with President Trump and President Kim Jong-un of North Korea. But prior to that, there was the first meeting since 2007 between the two Koreas, between South Korea and between North Korea. And it was a strategy involved in terms of what were they going to eat, right? And so what they ended up preparing was a flat sea fish to remind Mr. Moon, the president of South Korea, of his home port in the city of Busan. So they wanted to make him feel good and feel comfortable going to the negotiations. But they also, too, wanted to serve this Swiss roasty to kind of give lens and credit to Kim Jong-un from North Korea from his days in boarding schools in the Swiss, right? And so it's like this comforts of home, right? And this comforts of familiarity in order to break the ice and show deference, right? And so when you are doing your cooking and when you're thinking about these type of things, do you see the intentionality in terms of links of like these countries would go into the pageantry before the diplomacy and negotiations begin to take place?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a way of paying homage, and I think it's a really important step when you're thinking about creating someone else's food, or is to sort of make sure you pay that homage and show that respect as you're going through the process.
Now, let's take it over back here domestically, right? And so not only are we being introduced through banned food, your hashtag, introduced to those cuisines. Now, in your travels and your pursuits, how have you been able to connect with different individuals in the locales that you visit, right? In terms of really understand their culture, and then tell us, how did they feel when you began to ask them questions of their identity, of their constitution, through the lens of their spices, of their meats, of the way that they cook?
I think people are very proud of their heritage. So everywhere I've gone, it's been a really wonderful experience because people want to talk about it and they want to share what is core to who they are. I've had really incredible opportunities to connect with people, whether in, Goa or parts of Peru or South Africa, and really hear their stories. South Africa was particularly interesting because of kind of apartheid and the Dutch heritage that's there, Malay heritage, Indian, everything, obviously indigenous African heritage as well. But just to hear people's stories, and you sort of hear those stories as part and parcel of cooking and sitting and sharing a meal with somebody.
It's interesting you mentioned Peru, right? Because Peru has gone through this moment of broadening out who they are, right? And to really define themselves on a world stage. They really define themselves through the lens of food. And their government is giving lots of grants in order to promote tourism. So there's an economic draw into food, and to really showcasing the great cuisines of Peru globally, and really trying to partner with the United Nations, and really trying to partner with UNESCO, I believe, is a proper UNESCO.
Yeah.
Did I get it? Okay, good.
Or UNICEF?
Not UNICEF, I think it's UNESCO.
Okay.
In terms of
World Heritage.
Yeah, the World Heritage, right? To really get their food on the map in cuisine. As being a chef, as being an entrepreneur, talk to us about the importance of entrepreneurship through the lens of food that can really shape economic development in communities.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that you can turn it around and you can look at what happened here in the United States, and you can see that a lot of the foods that we eat today sort of stemmed from whether it's sort of immigration and immigrants coming in and needing to create economy and to create a customer base. And so I think kind of turning that around, investing in a community to support chefs, to support cooking, to support, the heritage that comes from the food that's there, that's being made, and turn it into industry. I think it's incredibly important. I had the great fortune of eating in Lima at Central, which is a chef by the name of Virgilio Martinez, and he is just, I was there by myself, and I ate a lovely 25-course meal by myself.
It's amazing.
He was, it's foundational, and it's amazing what he's doing. He uses the different biodiversities, the Amazon, the rainforest, the Amazon, right? The mountainous regions, the sea, to kind of create all of these different types of foods and cuisines from those local ingredients. I think that it's a wonderful showcase of art, but also it's a way to, maybe not at that level, but to create industry and interest in the food.
Industry is right there because it automatically goes to here in the States. When you think about like Chinese restaurants here in the States, and you hear about Mexican restaurants here in the state, and automatically think about growing up in Lansing, Michigan. My friend Pauline Lamb, they always had this Chinese restaurant that was in our city, and I've always looked at it, I'm going to study my homework at Pauline's restaurant, but I never looked at it from the lens of entrepreneurship. But through the older lens that I have now, I see it as this thriving entrepreneurship that was able to support her family, that our parents are able to do. Do you think having this type of conversations that we should now begin to not be so quick just to order the Chinese food, or not be so quick just to order the Mexican food without giving context to what that immigrant story is about or what that country is about? Or do you think now we are going to start paying attention because of everything that is happening?
Well, I mean, I think that I would love if that happened. I just don't know how many people on Taco Tuesday are particularly paying homage to Mexican heritage, realistically. You calling it soft diplomacy is a really great way to put it, because, hopefully there is some of that transference. But I think when you, just turning it back around to this Chinese story, and you look at the food that Chinese immigrants brought and then Chinese Americans sort of perpetuated, a lot of that was an adapted cuisine that isn't really sort of akin to what you'd be eating in China. It was one, obviously, what's available here. What are the ingredients that are local? And you're always sort of adapting to that wherever you go. And then it's, what's the palate of your customer base? So that changed what Chinese food is here. But I think the immigrant story obviously resonates. That will always sort of hold through.
Well, you've queued us up perfectly in terms of adaptability, in terms of the Chinese food having to adapt to the palates of Americans here in the United States in order to be successful with it. There is this adaptation as American franchises have to go abroad in terms of how do they adapt to the local customs and cultures and religions within that country. And I think now it's time to bring in our next guest to really help us give us context to that. And ladies and gentlemen, I told you I had some really powerful, smart, brilliant, fascinating individuals. Excuse me for geeking out over food, right? You wouldn't think you can geek out over food and policy, but I'm the guy to do that. This next guest goes by the name of Bill Edwards. Bill Edwards is CEO of Edwards Global Services. Listen to this, folks. He has assisted more than 30 U.S. franchisors in the educational, retail, restaurant, and service sectors all across the world, from Asia to Africa to Europe to Latin America to North America and the Middle East. His company really focuses on licensing, distribution, market research, technology, and most importantly, government relations. Bill has lived in China, the Czech Republic, folks, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Iran, Turkey, and the U.S. And he has directed projects in 68 countries. My gosh, Bill, you're a busy brother. EGS received the first U.S. President's Award for Export Excellence given to a franchise service company in recognition of the company's achievement. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Bill Edwards. What's happening, Bill?
Hi, Mike, from out here on the left coast in California. How are you today?
Man, I cannot blame you for being in the west coast of California. It has to be good to be able to be in the States just for a little while and sit still, man, because it seems like you travel extensively.
About 40% of the time, yeah.
That's amazing, man. Listen, Bill, from a nuts and bolts perspective, the Edwards Global Services, what is that exactly? Do you take companies like McDonald's or Burger King and just place them into Europe or into Russia or to the UAE?
Well, we take U.S. F&B brands and put them into the countries that are best fit for their brand. It might be one of those you named. It might be somewhere else. But our job is to figure out the best place for them to go for their particular brand, then help them find their partner, help them with supply chain, help them with adaptation of their brand and how to market best in the country, and get them to the point where they start up and take over themselves.
Now, Bill, is there a particular country that is emerging right now in terms of fast casual cuisine that's happening here in the United States, right? So is there a particular market that is more interested in burgers, or is there a particular market that's more interested in chicken or burritos, if you will?
Well, the most desired F&B brands from the United States are, in the order of priority, burgers, pizza, coffee, sandwiches, and family-style restaurants. So burgers, you think with all the brands that are out there that we'd be sold out but everybody wants burgers. And the most growth we see right now, frankly, is in Southeast Asia, markets like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand.
Wow. Well, when we think burgers, we automatically think such like an Americana kind of perspective, right? The cheeseburger and the hamburger. But what Alia was just talking about in terms of how China has had to adapt to the palates here in the United States. Over when we bring burgers into the Southeast Asia, what type of adaptation has to take place in terms of menus and what's on the items at these places?
Well, quite a lot. It depends on the country. Some markets where the GDP per capita is higher, the income is higher, you'll see lots of beef. And in other countries, you'll see lots of chicken rather than beef because of the cost of beef is so high. So you really have to adapt every country you go into. Even in Japan, when Carl's Jr. went into Japan, they had to change their hamburger buns because the Japanese want a higher artesian quality bun that smells buttery relative to what we have in the United States. So it all comes down to what you have to do to adapt in order to get the most customers to come to the brand.
Now, with that comes, though, is there a push-pull in terms of some of these American companies may not want to adapt in terms of losing what the brand is known for, or are they open and willing for adaptation to occur?
Well, you have to maintain the brand image. But if you take a look at something like Denny's, when they went into the Philippines, they have 20% of the dishes are locally developed. They still have their grand slams and everything everybody's used to, but they have about more than 20% of the menu was locally developed with their licensee. And that means that you maintain the brand integrity, Mike, but on the other hand, you increase the number of customers that are likely to come to the restaurant.
Wow.
So if a brand is not willing to adapt at all, I don't recommend they try to go anywhere else in the world.
That is awesome. Bill, we're going to take a quick break here on Sirius XM Insight Channel 121. You are listening to the Mike Muse Show. Folks, this is now a time to chime in if you're hungry. If you have menu items, or you have suggestions, or you have questions, and you want to get into the conversation, hit me up on my Twitter at I am Mike Muse. That's M-U-S and Sam E. Also on the Insight Channel at SXM Insight. And we'll be right back to keep the conversation going with our fantastic panelists.
The nephews is in the house. As soon as the beat drop, we got the streets locked overseas. A Punjabi MC in the rock. I came to see the mommies.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. Thanks for coming back and joining the Mike Muse Show. Hopefully you had a snack, something to munch on and to snack on while we're talking about food. We were just listening to Alia and Bill really talk about, from Alia's perspective, the cooking and the importance of food and the soft diplomacy and how food is such a great cultural exchange. And we're really getting into the meats and potatoes now of Bill Edwards to really talk about the government perspective and the business side perspective as these franchises here in the United States are trying to enter into these different world global markets. So Bill, the question I have, and you're just outlining the adaptation of the menu and what these brands need to do in order to adjust in order to get good sales. At what point in role does the local governments come into play once these franchises begin to decide, you know what, we're going to be in this country, or we're going to adapt our menu accordingly? At what point do you have to engage with the local governments?
Well, I can tell you one of the things that's great about that is governments love U.S. brands because we represent a reproducible business model that creates lots of trained jobs. Those businesses pay taxes, and they're formal businesses. They're not gray market. So the governments really like when the foreign brands come in because they operate in a very open and very professional way, and they create lots of jobs and help people get into the middle class in these countries.
So now economic development is occurring in the countries. What about culturally, Bill? Do you have to work with the franchisees as well as the local governments in terms of, do you see an impact of when American companies come over? Does it have an impact within these countries that you engage with and that you deal with? Do you see the American way beginning to shape and change the cultures of these countries?
To some extent you do, although it's critical that you acknowledge the fact that each country has local culture. If you don't acknowledge that, you're not going to have anybody coming through the door and eating at your restaurant. So I believe very strongly in all my 45 years of doing business around the world that the one big thing we have in the world that makes us different is culture. So we have to take a brand and a reproducible business model and make it fit the local culture in order for it to succeed.
So with that being said, in terms of fitting the culture, what are some of the barriers that you've seen, like when you began, like, for example, so you said that the emerging market right now is Southeast Asia. What has been the biggest barrier that you've seen in terms of the American brands participating in this culture and trying to fuse the two worlds together, from the American culture side and then from the Southeast Asia side?
Well, I think the biggest challenge we have nowadays is having a consistent quality supply chain. In other words, being able to find companies that produce food on a consistent basis at very high quality so we don't have quality problems. That's our biggest challenge in the growing markets.
Wonderful. Speaking of growing markets, Derek, I want to bring you into this conversation, ladies and gentlemen, because I have a secret. As I was telling you in the beginning of the conversation, that this conversation was really brought back and inspired by watching the 60 Minutes interview with the young prince, Saudi prince, who was over here. In the beginning, I saw the Shake Shack that was in the background of it. And I said, when I saw the Shake Shack in Saudi Arabia, you heard me say at the beginning, I shot up from my chair and I said, no way. And in finding the right perfect guest to curate it, I wanted an individual who was doing work in Saudi Arabia, bringing American fast food companies into that area and to really talk about shaping narratives and shaping cultures. And I think I found the right person, ladies and gentlemen. His name is Derek Yarbrough. He's a senior vice president of Alex Partners. But what's so unique about him, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that he's a former franchise owner of Papa John's Pizza franchise. So he's a franchise owner, and he's now part of a consulting firm that is actually placing a fast casual experience in Saudi Arabia. Derek Yarbrough, what is happening, man? Welcome to the Mike Muse Show.
Thank you, Mike, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, did I sum up your whole experience adequately for you, man?
Yes, you did.
I think I did in a nutshell, right?
That's it.
So talk to us a little bit about this restaurant and company that you kind of help position into Saudi Arabia. And what category is it? Is it the burgers? Is it the hot dogs? Is it the pizza? Is it chicken? And tell us what that experience was like putting it in Saudi Arabia.
Sure. So as you mentioned before, I was working on a engagement in Saudi Arabia actually earlier this year for a couple of months, and it was for a large American burger concept. And the concept has been there for some years, but what we're finding now is that a lot of the concepts that have been in place in Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states are now dealing with some of the challenges that are taking place. For example, with Vision 2030, which is a vision from the Prince in terms of how to shift the economy more from a public sector to a private sector, you have a lot of things that are changing, a lot of things that have actually started at the beginning of this year, from a VAT value-added tax, which was implemented on January 1st, to other tariffs that have been put on place in terms of utilities. So the purpose, I say that because the purpose was to come in and help this large concept, help it streamline its business, help it to be more efficient within the stores, within the operations, and also to look at ways to better compete with the competition. Because increasingly, as you have mentioned, there are more and more international brands that are coming into these areas, and the ones that are there currently, they have to figure out ways in terms of how to remain competitive and how to remain relevant.
But I like how you mentioned in terms of from the government and the policy perspective over in Saudi Arabia, Prince Salman, in terms of shifting the labor workforce, if you will, and getting it into the private sector, because right now a lot of it is government run and run by the royal family. In doing that, does the prince and the royal government over there believe that these type of franchises is the way to create new economies of scale scale, if you will, seeing how these models have worked so well here in the United States?
I think that's actually a good point, is that what you have is you have these international concepts that are coming here, and they're obviously are getting support from the franchisors, whether they are in the United States or in Europe, and they're helping to kind of redefine how they're measuring productivity, redefine how they're figuring out what are the most profitable entrees to service. And with this in mind, you obviously have a budding community, whereas you have other concepts that are continuing to grow, and they're actually becoming formidable competitors to these international concepts. So in a roundabout way to answer your question, I do believe that the Prince is something that he is very supportive of, because the other thing that people don't realize is as you have these huge international concepts that come, there's kind of a dominoes effect of having of higher end restaurants that come into the city, whereas in Riyadh you have a very I would say I'm surprised by the quality of some of the food there from some of the higher end restaurants. So it's almost like an ecosystem, whereas we obviously are talking about fast food and fast casual, but at the same time too, it's almost like it's a rising tide of all concepts of what you see across the kingdom.
It is, and what was interesting about that, Derek, is that you can't think about Shake Shack and these really new cool fast casual burgers that are popping up right now, in addition to social media that is popping up in terms of like Snapchat, right? And so what we're seeing now, and I'm sure you can speak to that firsthand, over in Saudi Arabia, the way that the interaction is occurring amongst the millennial set between the boys, the young men and the young women, are really occurring through Snapchat and through these different social media markets. And food is one of the most snapped items that you'll find on Snapchat. I mean, we have Alia here who has an incredible Instagram, and so food is really taking over the Instagram experience for food. So you almost see this convergence of these two worlds that are kind of coexisting. And with that being said, I want you to address that aspect of it, Derek, in terms of the convergence of the two and how you guys have either thought through that process, but then also too in the sense of how is it breaking down social norms, because here fast food is just fast food, but over in other countries it could be a date night. Fast food is kind of looked at as more expensive over here. So can you just talk to us a little bit and give us context for those of us who haven't had a fast casual burger over in Saudi Arabia?
That's a good point, Mike. And I think the thing we want to talk about is important is that there is no alcohol in the kingdom. And because of that, the biggest social activity is dinner. And interestingly, dinner is generally later in the kingdom than what you might find over in the United States. So when you think about that, and when you couple the point of how is social media becoming a more important component within the kingdom, the concept that I was working with specifically, they're shifting a lot of their marketing dollars from kind of traditional ad to the social media side. And in addition to that, they're looking at ways of working with aggregators. And aggregators, I'm referring to like Uber Eats, Hungry Station, and some of the other concepts in terms of how to make sure that they're not only drawing people in, but also that they can actually deliver the food. And so it's interesting because you do find that food is very much so is the center of sort of socializing, given the point that you don't find females with men that are not their relatives. But nonetheless, you are finding that food is kind of the center point of families for socializing. So
then, Derek, would you say, I mean, you're talking about Uber Eats. I mean, we're talking about now shared economy, shared workforce, if you will. Now we're really talking about this American way of life, if you will. Do you believe that this is having an effect on soft diplomacy in terms of how members of the Gulf states in Saudi Arabia and the UAE are really looking at how American culture is creating shifts within their countries?
I absolutely do think so. Kind of an adjacency there is Uber in and of itself is widespread throughout Riyadh. And it is because there was a need for it, because the current taxi system that they have was not very conducive for people that are traveling there for work. And so Uber is actually very big and very robust. And what you find is that when you get in a car with an Uber driver, you have a lot of very intellectual viewpoints on what's going on in the world, from the United States with what's going on in other parts of the world. And what's interesting is that when you have these conversations, there's a high level of interaction between the people who live there and then in terms of people who are expats and they're working. So you find that it's a natural way for people to kind of come together in a way that might not otherwise happen.
Derek, I wish you can see me right now. I'm literally grabbing onto this microphone stand right now as you're talking, man, because this is what I was hoping the conversation would be as I curated this to kind of do a deep dive and to explore that. And Alia, sitting right here, has been to Saudi Arabia, Alia, and as he begins to talk about, the sharedness of food and the sharedness of culture, as you being a woman, and we know a lot of the strict policies are happening over in the Gulf states in terms of the separation of the men, versus the women. How do you see food as possible in terms of eventually bringing these two worlds together in terms of interaction? And could it be through the economic scale of chefs that is happening as you visited UAE Gulf state countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely food being the hub and the center and bringing people together is and that happening anywhere is pretty cool. I think the idea of technology aiding that in a different way is a fascinating place, and what I hadn't thought about personally and that I'm hearing in this conversation is the idea of taking what has traditionally been a home culture of dinners, that are cooked at home, and changing that and shifting that to take advantage of the ease of something like an Uber Eats, and bringing that to people. Now, for me, that's against healthy living. That all of that accessibility is not what you want in terms, because there's so many longitudinal studies that show that people are healthier when they cook for themselves. So we're kind of adding, and whether this is American culture or technology now, a shift in the diets of people around in different countries. I think that's a really fascinating thing, that twist that I had not even thought of until you guys just started talking.
Well, Bill, I want to bring you into that conversation in terms of the healthy eating and the shift in dynamics that are occurring, and to really have you give some more context to what Derek is mentioning about in terms of technology and the Uber Eats, and in terms of how these fast casual companies and fast food restaurants are having to adapt to that. I was looking at a study over in Brazil, and they were talking about these multinational corporations that are now coming over into Brazil and is changing the diet of the citizens over in Brazil in terms of the weight gain, but it's also changing the commodities of what the farmers now are actually farming in order to increase, for the supply and demand of these snack foods, if you will. So, Bill, when you're working with your franchisees to come over to these different countries, are you guys taking that into consideration now? One, the technology aspect of it, and then two, to make sure that the eating patterns and behaviors are able to be healthy and consistent with the natural palate and cuisine of these countries that you guys are going into?
Well, you have to adapt the menu to the culture, or else people won't come into the restaurant. So if you look at U.S. brands going into the Middle East, they all have to become what's called halal. In other words, there's no pork. And with a lot of brands, like, for example, a Denny's or Carl's, that could be a big thing, that they have to make a change. One of the things that Derek mentioned that was no alcohol in Saudi Arabia. So what takes the place of that? And what we found is the creation of really high-end juice drinks, believe it or not, which are healthy, but are also expensive and very complicated, that go on the menus of restaurants rather than alcohol. It's really an unusual thing, but it's actually happened not only in Saudi Arabia, but in the rest of the Gulf states also.
Now,
development of juices are typically healthy. And the Arabs tend to pay quite a lot for those types of things in their marketplace. So that's an adaptation that's actually pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Bill, as we talk about switching the healthiness in terms of the drinks, if you will, from that dynamic and that perspective, are governments being mindful of the way that these American businesses are coming in and monitoring? I know you said earlier in the conversation they're happy that they're there because it does spur up the economy. But is there any reservations that some of the governments may have in the different countries that you've worked with, was that the American companies will infuse American culture and begin to shift paradigms, what we're discussing, really what Derek and Aya is just mentioning in terms of the paradigm shift of like a Uber Eats, right? And the paradigm shift of this cultural exchange of dialogue, right? Or have you met any of that type of resistance at all?
Not really. Not really. We have to, of course, watch what the food is in each country. If you go into India, there's no pork and beef, no beef. So you have to make an adaptation. But the government coming in and telling us that they want a certain type of food, I frankly have not seen before.
But Derek, as a franchise owner, as a Papa John's owner, I'm sure you have met with many other American franchisees owners. Why is it important for these American companies and franchisees to go over to these other countries? And obviously the default answer is increase your demographic of the population that you can service, obviously, right? But what are some of the other benefits of a franchise owner who are living here in the States to want to take their brand into these different countries?
I think there could probably be a list of items to think about. And obviously, I think you've mentioned one that economically it makes sense as you broaden your scope internationally. But I think it goes back to the first part of the conversation that, once you check the box on several items, number one, we figured that, you find a master franchise who can service the Gulf region, right? And, they will cover, locations in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, et cetera. You spread your brand, and what you really do is that you're creating an international system. It's all about an ecosystem. And once you get one concept there, you bring another concept there. And it really does kind of soften the stand where they don't realize the benefit. But when you have someone from another country that comes to the U.S. and you can immediately relate with that person on a level that, you might not be able to do otherwise previously, there's a connection there. And it's really important that people understand it, because when I was out there working on this engagement, some of the senior managers that we spoke with, they were coming back to the U.S. for certain training. So they were coming back for training at some of the Ivy League institutions and things like that, and then they take that back over there and they share that information. So you find that you're broadening your scope. Secondly, what you find is that the United States encourages sort of soft power, because it spreads the sense of democracy, the sense of, you can work your way up. I mean, what was interesting is that, as we know here in the United States, you can have someone who starts out as a line cook or something, and they're dedicated, they're coming to work on time, they're open-minded to things, and then they can gradually work their way up from a shift lead to a general manager, to a regional operator, and et cetera. You're finding that these are the things that are happening in other parts of the world, and it's pretty incredible, especially in areas where a lot of times is, the demographic that you grow up in, and sometimes it's kind of hard to break through that. So I think it's a lot of different touch points. I'm not sure if I exactly addressed it, but there are a lot of reasons why companies think of moving otherwise, and why they're getting the encouragement from the countries that where they're established in.
I think you did in a really fantastic way, in particular how you hit home with the whole democracy perspective. I mean, we hear that a lot lately right now, and we see what's happening with the Central American migrants that are coming over here now, and we're hearing this whole conversation about there's instability within the region, and this whole notion of the U.S. sending aid over into these countries in order to provide stability, in order to provide democracy, right? And so if these governments and these institutions inside these governments can create a new workforce, and they can create a new economy, then therefore, as you mentioned, Darren, there's this shared workforce, the shared economy kind of will uplift everyone, right, and create the stability in the workforce. But as I switch, Bill, and speaking of, now we're looking at global issues, right? I can't help but think about the conversation we're having around tariffs now, right? And soybeans, and that's kind of going back and forth, and pork, as we look at the NAFTA and the NAFTA trade. We know all these different types of commodities are needed in order for these American franchises to thrive over in these different countries. Bill, in your work and in the company that you have, are you guys taking a look at the tariff conversations that are happening, right? And if so, how is it impacting the potential expansion of these American franchises, and or how are you guys working with the current franchisees to make sure they're able to still stay afloat with the tariffs conversation that we're having?
Well, it's a big thing. There are really three major components to the cost of running a restaurant: the cost of the food, the cost of the labor, and the cost of the rent. And some of these trade problems are beginning to raise the cost of food. And that means the bottom line gets smaller. It means that growth doesn't occur. You won't open as many units in a country if you can't get the product at a price where you can actually make money. So it sounds like a macroeconomic thing, but in actual fact, it's hitting the individual restaurants at their bottom line if they're having to pay more for food due to tariffs.
I mean, even Aya, as you have worked in restaurants here in New York City as a chef and the creative culinary director of an Indian restaurant, Janoon, here, you have to talk about price margins and the cost of food. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about that for those of us who just casually go to restaurants and will pay $9.99 for an entree or maybe $15.99 for an entree, not really realizing to us it seems so arbitrary, right? And so as a chef, as Bill mentioned, it is a very micro level. Isn't this macro perspective that we're looking at, but it's very at this micro level. Talk to us a little bit about how tariffs and commodities and those things can impact and adjust prices at restaurants.
Oh, absolutely. Food costs is a constant. I wouldn't say battle, but it's something that as a chef you're constantly vigilant of. You're always sort of working on that margin. It is not arbitrary. Everything is costed down to the unit, and so I'm sure in these countries that people are feeling the real effects of these tariffs. And it's also interesting. I was actually reading a case study of a burger joint from Detroit, I think it was, that went to Malaysia, and they had to sort of create industry and have someone create provolone cheese to mimic the provolone cheese that's on their burgers and their sliders, and so trying to find those places internally. I guess they were. It's an interesting sort of battle between what you can do, what you have to pay tariffs on, versus what can you produce from in-house and all of that stuff. So I think there's a lot to be said about how businesses can really be affected.
And Jared, that leads me to you as a former franchise owner of Papa John's and now responsible for putting these restaurants inside of Saudi Arabia. Is this something that your company is looking at too as well? But you really have that unique point of view as a franchise owner, so you can understand what these owners are feeling as they enter these different countries.
Sure, and I'll say that in two ways very quickly. That as personally as a former franchisee, that was my biggest cost on the P&L. And for us as a Papa John's franchisees, I'm sure you can imagine that cheese is the biggest component of your food costs, and they accounted for 30% of our food costs. And in 2013, there was the cost of black cheese was just going through the roof. And there wasn't much that you could do about it but try to manage other costs and then try to smooth forward. And then we got some relief a year or so after that. And as we transition into what I do now is that we spend a lot of time in terms of working with our clients and in terms of how to better manage their food costs. In fact, what we do is we have a system we call menu engineering, whereas we will look at every entree and look at the profitability of it and look at the volume. And based on how the cost of food is flowing currently or how we project it to be, we can make recommendations in terms of how they can modify their menu so that they can get the most profitable items off to their customers in a way that they're also enjoyable as well too. So that's something you think about constantly because it is such a key part of your P&L.
Mm-hmm. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a wildly fascinating conversation as we look into food diplomacy globally. Each of you has come from a very different perspective in terms of how we should be looking at the dynamics of food and in policy. So, Derek, man, as we begin to just really think about this conversation that we're having and the importance of soft diplomacy, I'm just me personally, in my personal constitution, I'm a huge fan of soft diplomacy. I think soft diplomacy kind of gets overlooked in its impact that it can have in shaping policies and for really strong economic development in our countries and its different regions and the shared services that can exist as we begin to grow this global economy. I believe that our economies now are more shared globally than we actually give credit to, and then that we actually realize, and in particular, Derek, within the Gulf states and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which you have such great expertise and experience in. From your point of view, in closing, how do you view food and food policy and soft diplomacy going forward as more fast food and fast casual American-style companies are entering these markets? Where do you see that going long term?
I think that's something that a lot of people are actually focused on in terms of making sure it's the right balance. Because I think what you'll find is that some of these, whether it's the UAB or the Kingdom, is that they're also going to be very supportive of some of the local businesses becoming growing and having a certain breadth. So it's something that I think it's important to continue to use because it's just such a natural way for people globally to be able to interact with one another. I mean, we talk about when we were actually in Dubai, we were having dinner and we were talking about, someone was talking about their love for Italian, someone else was talking about their love for a certain new American food. And so what you're finding is that it is so easy to be able to relate to others because of our general love for foods, and not only but foods of other cultures. And so it will be important to continue to expand, and at the same point too, also to be cognizant that local businesses within these countries are going to also be given an opportunity, or they're going to take the opportunity as well to expand their business. And it's generally a plus because as the populations continue to grow, there's a greater need. And as we talked about within Saudi, where the economy is shifting, whereas now women are able to drive, and that just only leads to more opportunities for work. There's going to be more need for food. So I think it's really a natural fit to continue to expand food, international food brands into these markets because there's going to be a greater need for it.
Well, with that being said, go straight to Aya. You have a way of being able to use activism in your own terms and to define it for yourself, right, through the lens of culinary art and through cooking. Do you think there should be a call to action for chefs in order to step up to the plate and amplify the work that they're doing in order to show different cultures and to show more empathy for these immigrants and migrants that we talked about so frequently here in the United States, to do similar to what you're doing?
No, I mean, absolutely. I think there is that. I think it is required, but I think you do see that. I think you are seeing chefs that are, there's a lot of groups that have been forming to showcase immigrant food and refugee stories. And, you see these sort of informal, formal gatherings that have been taking place. So I think you are seeing a lot of grassroots movement if you're sort of tapped into that food community, with people really using that platform to give a voice to these issues. And I think it's a beautiful thing. Well,
I appreciate the work that you're doing, even in creating this app where it takes individuals on a journey to really understand food and history and context from across the globe to learn.
Issa's Edible Adventures, and it's iOS only right now, but there's some fun things in the works coming up, so hopefully you'll see it in more places.
And I've been talking about your Instagram. Give out your Instagram handle, your Twitter, if people want to get more involved in your movement, your banned foods movement, and get to know you a little bit better in terms of the movement that you're creating. How can they reach you?
My Instagram and Twitter, Facebook, everything is pretty much at Aaliyah Lee Kong, and Lee Kong is like Bruce Lee and King Kong. Lee Kong.
Spell it all out.
ALIYALEEKONG.
Awesome. And then Derek, man, how can people reach you? Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, your company's website. They want to learn more information about the great work that you're doing, and really in terms of creating these movements and conversations over the UAE, Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia. That's just a place that we don't have a lot of exposure to. And so if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing, how can they reach you?
Sure. I work for a firm. The name of the firm is Alex Partners, and you can go www.alex, ALIXPARTNERS.com.
Awesome, man. You guys have been a fantastic guest. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bill, for joining the Mike Muse Show. I couldn't have done this conversation without you. Ladies and gentlemen, you can always find me at I am Mike Muse, M-U-S and Sam E. Until next time, folks, I'm going to get something to eat. Peace.